Hello, and welcome to the Healthy Brain Research Network's webinar, which is a discussion of editors, a panel of editors from a variety of aging journals in the field. The editors that we have with us today, next slide please. Our first presenter today is Dr. Joseph Gaugler. He is the editor of the Journal of Applied Gerontology. Dr. Gaugler is a long-term care professor in nursing, the director of graduate studies at the Center on Aging at the University of Minnesota. Our second presenter today will be Dr. Rebecca Allen. Dr. Allen is the editor for the Americas of the Aging and Mental Health Journal. She is a professor of clinical psychology at Alabama's Research Institute on Aging at the University of Alabama. Our third presenter today is Dr. Rachel Pruchno. Dr. Pruchno is the editor-in-chief of the Gerontologist. She is an endowed professor of gerontology at the Rowan University School of Osteopathic Medicine. Next slide, please. My name is Dr. Lisa McGuire. I am lead of CDC's Healthy Aging Program, and I will be your moderator today. Next slide. So before we begin, just a few housekeeping things. So if you have questions at any point today during the presentations, please hover down at the very bottom of your screen and you will see a Q&A button, and it looks like a file folder with a Q on it. Please click there and type your question, and your question will either be entered in writing or answered in writing by one of the presenters, or we will go through the questions during the moderated question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Please note that our webinar today will be recorded, and the recording will be made available. All registrants will be sent a link to all and are welcome to distribute it as well too. So we'll go ahead and start today with our first presenter, Dr. Joseph Gaugler.
Well, thanks so much, Lisa. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much to all of you for attending here today. I think you'll see and hear a lot of great perspectives related to disseminating our research, and particularly disseminating our peer-reviewed research in various types of scientific outlets. So what I wanted to do today was to talk about selecting a journal, and what are some of the tips, I guess, that I've learned and have tried to practice, really from three different perspectives. One, certainly as editor of the Journal of Applied Gerontology, which I've been since 2011, and I'll be ending my term, or second term specifically, on July 1st this year. But then also as member of various editorial boards, and finally, certainly as an author myself. And I guess this is essentially collated wisdom that I've come across over the past several, or couple decades at least, that I've been conducting research. So next slide, please. Oh, am I controlling the slide? Sorry. Okay, I didn't realize that. Okay, great. Whoops. Okay, so first I wanted to talk about selecting a journal and addressing some of the questions that were posed, and you know, really thinking about each of these. You know, first and foremost, you know, one of the questions we wanted to talk about today is, how do you select the most appropriate journal for a manuscript? It seems fairly straightforward question, but sometimes a little more nuanced than one would think in terms of identifying the right fit for your particular study. Second, how do we learn about what journal topics are being sought out in order to prevent wasting time submitting to different ones and hope that one will be accepted? So thinking about, again, trying to be efficient not only on our behalf in terms of identifying an outlet that's most appropriate, but then also perhaps also trying to avoid wasting the time not only of the editors and editorial staff, but then eventually of reviewers as well. This other question, which certainly is posed to me quite a bit, are editors willing to review abstracts to assess suitability of the topic for publication? The fourth question, which I think actually cross-cuts much more than just qualitative work, but really thinking from a methodological perspective, what is the kind of work that certain journals publish? in terms of thinking about specific reviewers, is that worthwhile to identify? And again, that certainly varies journal by journal, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the last question I wanted to address here was, how important is ranking and the impact factor? How do we navigate these rankings when submitting manuscripts? And we'll talk a little bit about that too in my presentation. So first, thinking about that initial question, selecting a journal and how do we pick the right journal? One of the things I think that's really important to do, and sometimes we often don't do this as authors, is first and foremost is really reviewing the scope and mission of the journal. Now, certainly when we go to a journal webpage or even review, say, the hard copy masthead of a journal, sometimes we may give short shrift to the idea that actually reviewing the scope and mission isn't important, that's just kind of filler. And in fact, if we review table of contents over a certain period of time or over a certain period of issues, that'll give us a good understanding what the scope and mission of the journal is. Now, while that's important, I still think it is critical to review the scope and mission of the journal in terms of how the journal describes itself and how it positions itself. I know as editor for the Journal of Applied Gerontology, I did take some time to revise and update the scope and mission of the journal to ensure that we were basically positioning the journal in such a way that it would attract the kind of submissions that we felt were the best fit. Now, that being said, I do see with many, many authors when I'm screening manuscripts upon submission that they clearly don't review the scope and mission of the journal. They're submitting papers that really aren't a great fit for our particular outlet. And to me, if authors had reviewed the scope and mission at the first place, they would have submitted papers that were more appropriate. The second tip I provided here is identify similarly focused research published recently or during the tenure of the current editor in your candidate journal. First and foremost, I think it's important to, when identifying similar research that's been published in a given journal, you want to make sure that that maps on to the current editor and the current editor's tenure. Because certainly certain editors may have a particular affinity for a certain type of work versus others, and you want to be cognizant of that when selecting a particular journal for your particular work. The next point, too, I think is really important is, now many journals have taken to, if not forcing candidate authors, strongly encouraging authors to cite work that's been published recently in the journal. Now, to be honest, a lot of the times this is for the purposes of the journal to increase its own impact factor, but above and beyond that, one thing I know I try to do as an author, and one way I try to determine, and I use to determine whether my work is relevant for a given journal, is to see, has work been published previously, or at least recently, in this particular journal that I can then meaningfully cite in my particular manuscript. Because I think then that helps in a way answer this question that you may have of, is my paper actually appropriate for a given journal? Getting at one of the other questions, but this is something else I thought about, is ascertaining whether the methodological framework of your study aligns with the candidate journal. And when I say methodological framework, it's thinking about things like, how much does this given journal emphasize theory or conceptual frameworks? Some journals really expect you to have a theory or at least a conceptual framework to more or less ground your study and proceed accordingly. Other journals may not really emphasize theory or conceptual frameworks that much, but nonetheless, I think that's important to know. Does a given journal emphasize these types of methodological facets? And certainly when we think of methodology, we can think of things like design types and frameworks as well. Certain journals may be more comfortable with publishing and disseminating methodological approaches such as randomized controlled trials, whereas others may not so much. And that certainly then dictates the types of methods a given journal is comfortable with. So this led me to think too about the question that was posed related to qualitative research, or more importantly, or I don't think more importantly, but relatedly mixed methods as well. Some journals provide a welcome research that is more qualitative in orientation or mixed methods as well. And in some cases, and some of the subsequent presenters may address this, some of these journals actually provide more lenient word limits to feature or welcome this type of work. Other journals, however, such as clinical journals in some disciplines, aren't as open to mixed methods, or simply have a very firm word limit that makes it very difficult to publish qualitative or mixed methods research of a given rigor. Again, reviewing the scope and mission of the journal, certainly reviewing the instruction to authors and guidelines to authors is important and informative in this regard. Now, that being said, Certain disciplines, I'm thinking of nursing, for example, and there are others as well. Even clinical nursing journals certainly are open to qualitative and mixed methods research. However, as an author, it will take a fair amount of work, I would argue, to condense and craft a rigorous qualitative or mixed method article to fit sometimes within these more restrained word limits or formatting guidelines. And then I think I've just addressed this, ascertain whether the formatting standards influence the quality of your manuscript. This certainly feeds into what we've just talked about here. So in terms of journal topics sought, calls for papers, special issues on journal websites. This is probably the easiest way for an author to determine whether a candidate journal has interest in the particular topic that one study is emphasizing. As we've talked about here multiple times, reviewing the scope and mission statement of the journal is really important to determine whether a particular topic of interest is one that will fit the scope of a given journal as well. Now, in terms of my own experience as editor of the Journal of Applied Gerontology, I've always seen myself first and foremost as a gatekeeper of quality. So I screen all manuscripts when they're submitted to determine, first and foremost, not only is their rigor appropriate and is their quality meet the standards of our journal, but secondly, does a given article fit our journal? So certainly for the Journal of Applied Gerontology, a big point of emphasis, given the title of the journal, is the research that's disseminated in our journal must have some type of application, whether that's clinical application, it could certainly have conceptual theoretical application, policy, relevance, etc. It must have that emphasis, and that emphasis must be stated clearly. If a study is submitted and doesn't emphasize that right away, I'm more likely than not, I'm going to screen that out. We make this very clear in the scope and mission statement of the journal. We certainly make it clear in terms of the prior work that's been published in the journal. But again, some authors, for whatever reasons, don't seem to acknowledge that or don't pay attention. And when that happens, the likelihood of their article being screened out goes up exponentially. This idea of policing of topics, to me, really depends on the scope of a journal. Some journals tend to, I guess, be much more narrow in terms of the types of topics they're willing to grapple with. This really depends on the journal. It may also depend on the particular discipline that you want to disseminate in. I know certainly for the Journal of Applied Gerontology, I don't really police certain topics per se. I really don't even police the types of methodology that's submitted per se. I just tend to focus more on the overall scope and fit of the articles that are being submitted as well as their overall quality. Keeping that in mind, that is what more or less I base my decisions on in terms of allowing a manuscript to go to the next step of peer review. This is a question that has come up, it certainly has crossed my desk quite a bit, is this idea of editors' willingness to review abstracts prior to submission. I think some editors are open to this. In my experience as an author, to be honest, I haven't found editors to be very open or welcoming of this per se. For example, submitting an abstract and saying, dear editor so-and-so, will this actually fit in your journal? What do you think? Is this a good potential study to submit to your journal? I get this question an awful lot as editor of Journal of Applied Gerontology. I'm assuming Becky and Rachel as well may, given their journals and the number of submissions to theirs. To be honest, I often just give this stock answer because at a certain point I got kind of tired of answering it as an editor because I got it so much. Is basically kind of reinforcing what we've talked about here today. I encourage you as an author to review the recently published articles as well as the submission guidelines on our webpage, and then you should be able to determine if your paper fits the scope of our journal. That by and large is how I approach these questions as now editor. And as author, before I was editor, one would think, well, editors should be more open to answering these questions. But then once I became editor, I got this question so much that basically I just decided to provide the stock answer as my go-to to more or less be efficient and save time. And so again, as author, I think it's implicit upon you to do the legwork to determine if your paper is appropriate for a given journal. I think some of the tips we've described and elucidated here earlier would be a good strategy to employ. I'm going to conclude my section here on the importance and navigation of impact factors. I provided this link here in terms of where to find impact factors for journals in your given area. Certainly many journals themselves publish their impact factor and ranking within the category or within their given category directly on their home pages. I think Aging and Mental Health does that. I know the Gerontologist does that. The Journal of Applied Gerontology does that as well. The journal citation reports often are available vis-a-vis library subscription. That's how I usually access it through the University of Minnesota. Your institution would likely have access to this as well. So is impact factor important as an author? In brief, it is. Certainly in academic context, many tenure and promotion committees will use this information when trying to gauge the quality of the work disseminated by a given author. Certainly publication in a journal of higher impact factor always leads to greater exposure for a citation by other articles and authors, and that of course is another metric that is often used to gauge what is the quality of a given paper that's submitted. How many times has it been cited by other authors and other articles? Now that being said, there are by no means universal indicators of quality or impact of a given article. You know, the question posed to me was dealing with the impact factor, but then there now are new author level indicators as well. There's the H metric, for example, which is basically used to determine what is the overall impact of a given author in terms of the number of times they've been cited, for example. There's even new metrics that have been developed. For example, the alt metric, which takes into account not just cross-citation, but then also things like downloads, social media mentions, etc. So for those of you that may perhaps are in non-academic contexts or maybe want to seek out different ways to gauge the impact of your work, a metric like alt metric may be actually more important to you than H metric or even impact factors or cross citations are. In the end, in general, how is this journal viewed in your field? Sometimes I think an apt metaphor when I think of journals is sometimes it's almost like car makers in the auto industry. Certain journals are viewed qualitatively in a certain way, even given maybe some of their more quantitative factors have taken a dip or aren't as high. Sometimes certain journals have a certain prestige that's important to remember and to consider when you're thinking about submitting it. And then finally, I think as an author, and one thing I do look at as well, because you know, not all of my work sometimes goes in the absolute top highest tier journal. Does the journal offer articles that I publish in it enough exposure where, for example, in key scientific databases, for me, PubMed is important, for you it may be another, where authors can find the work and then can cite it and judge it on its own merits. In this day and age, particularly this digital age where we're rapidly moving away from the importance of print publication to digital publication and digital distribution and accessibility, oftentimes as an author, I think it's important to have authors access your particular article vis-a-vis trusted resources, trusted scientific databases, and then once that happens, authors kind of vote with their feet per se. They will cite your article and determine its quality, whether in terms of them citing it, etc. I think that's as important as well as determining the overall journal's impact factor. So that concludes my slides here. Elisa, I don't know if we're going to take questions now. Are we going to take them after at the end?
Okay, Joe, yes, we're going to take questions at the end.
Okay.
If you do have a question for Dr. Gaugler for this excellent presentation, go down to the bottom of the screen, hover, you will see a black bar appear, and click in the Q&A button, and you can type your question for Dr. Gaugler. He can either answer them while he's listening to the other presentations, or we'll discuss them at the end. So thank you once again, Joe. Excellent presentation.
Great.
Our next presenter today is Dr. Rebecca Allen, and she's going to give us her insights as editor of Aging and Mental Health.
Well, hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Am I coming through?
You sound great. We're just waiting for the slides to switch.
Outstanding. Okay, well, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today and with this esteemed panel, and thank you for the invitation. So my job was to talk with you a bit about preparing your manuscript for submission. And so I'm going to go through some strategies for how to make your paper more publishable, and then all of this is couched under the rubric of mentorship. And I start all of my talks with a quote. As a first-generation scholar myself, perhaps some of you also are first-generation scholars, I found this quote from Joshua Marine: "Challenges are what make life interesting, and overcoming them is what makes life meaningful." So publishing your work is, of course, a challenge, but it is well worth the reward. Okay. And so I am clicking a number of different buttons, and nothing seems to be moving forward. I am controlling, and I'm clicking on my mouse and the arrow keys. Okay, there's some weirdness. I understand now what the problem is. Okay. So in terms of the objectives, first we're going to go through what you need to know about successful manuscript preparation, communicating with journal editors, and I'm sure that Joe and Rachel will have input in that as well, what you need to know before you submit. Very briefly, as a specific example for those of you out there who may be early in your training, we'll go through an overview of manuscript submission process at Aging and Mental Health, and then just a bit on peer review and mentorship, and laying the groundwork for long-term publication success or dissemination of your work. Okay, so the first thing really to keep in mind is that when you submit your manuscript, you are creating a first impression. So the first submission does have meaning and creates a relationship of sorts with the editor and with the reviewers if you get past the editorial review stage. As such, then, your cover letter matters. So know who the editor is. After you've selected your journal, as Dr. Gaugler discussed with us, it's important to sort of get to know the scope and the editorial board of the journal that you've selected for the potential publication of your work. Also know how your manuscript fills a gap in the literature, particularly as it relates to publication in that journal outlet, again, as Dr. Gaugler mentioned. And then another aspect of how to make your paper more publishable is, like I say, attention to detail. So your references matter. When you submit your manuscript, be mindful of the journal's guidelines. Not only do word limits and figure limits count, and the types of articles that might be published, qualitative, quantitative, or mixed, but pay attention to whether the journal asks for references in APA or AMA format. Also, be careful if you're using referencing software. Don't automatically assume that EndNote or RefWorks or whatever you may be using has correctly placed your references in your manuscript. Oftentimes there will be a additional initial or other things that will creep in if you rely solely on the software. Okay, so in communicating with journal editors, know what's needed. And know about peer review and mentorship, as it is the groundwork for long-term success. Okay, so before you submit, be sure to have input from your writing team. Most science these days, of course, is collaborative, and most of us are writing in collaborative teams. Read your paper over and over again. That's going to catch those odd little mistakes or typos that may creep in, like if you're using reference software. Make it pithy, even though cutting material may feel like cutting off your finger. As Joe discussed, word limits and figure limits and table limits matter. They are important. Also, Aging and Mental Health is an international journal, and so it's very helpful for everyone particularly for those who may not speak English as a first language, or again, for first-generation scholars, have others who are not on your writing team review your paper and provide feedback before submission. It's sort of a gentle peer review when you ask your friends to review your work, and that will catch things that you may not be aware of or may have overlooked in the reading and rereading. Okay. So we said that. Interprofessional teams do create better manuscripts. And I said that about international journals, and I said that about first-generation scholars. Okay. So these are just screenshots, again, as an example. Certainly, Journal of Applied Gerontology and the Gerontologist are outstanding journals in our field. This is just FYI for those of you who may be newer to the publication process. So this is a screenshot of Scholar One portal for submitting an article to Aging and Mental Health. So you have created an account for yourself, and then in terms of actually submitting, you know, you have to go through begin submission. If you are using EndNote, then you have an EndNote submission, but trust me, the website will not catch all of the problems that you may encounter, so be careful. Then the first step would be entering, of course, your what kind of manuscript you're submitting. For Aging and Mental Health, it may be an original article. You could be submitting a review or systematic review or narrative review, letter to the editor or editorial. And then, of course, you have to input your title. And so my title here is How to Submit a Manuscript to Aging and Mental Health. And then, of course, you enter your abstract. And I say here, this is really important, as it may be the only thing that your reader ever reads once you get past publication. You want to be able to communicate in 250 words or less what you have found and how your work adds to the literature, fills that gap. Each journal has its own format for abstracts, but generally they're about 250 words. Now, selecting your keywords is a very important step, and at Aging and Mental Health, we do have a drop-down box, as you see there. We publish quite a bit of work on dementia, cognitive disorders, interventions, memory impairment, mild cognitive impairment, all of those things. We're also very open to qualitative and mixed method research. Usually those are going to be longer manuscripts. We're also developing an emphasis in palliative and end-of-life care, and would be very happy to receive manuscript submissions in that topic area. And then you enter your author information. So I'm corresponding author. You add all of the different authors in your writing team. Then you have the opportunity to select reviewers. And one of the questions that was posed to the panel is how to select reviewers when asked. So what you want to do is you can type in people that you would like to have review your manuscript, and then you would potentially type in people that you do not want to have review your manuscript. By typing in our friend and colleague, Dr. Lisa McGuire, I actually do want her to review my manuscripts, although that says oppose reviewers. So think carefully about the individuals who are familiar with the line of research, others who have published in that line of research, and others who would render a fair and useful review. Those are the people that you want to suggest as potential reviewers for your manuscript. But of course, that decision is in the hands of the editor, and so you can make suggestions and they may or may not be followed. Okay. Here's where you have the opportunity to upload your cover letter, and remember, the editor will see your cover letter, so you know, don't submit a cover letter to, say, Journal of Aging and Health, not represented here today, and then forget if that manuscript doesn't make in that particular journal, and send the same cover letter to Aging and Mental Health because we're not the same editorial team. Be sure and change the name of the editor to whom you're addressing your correspondence. Okay, and then you indicate whether or not your work is funded, and then you have several questions, sort of a check on ethics check and attention check. Has this manuscript been submitted previously to this journal? That's very important, because if you're submitting your revision at Aging and Mental Health, and I've been an associate editor since 2012, editor just since January 2017, we try to only send manuscripts out for one round of review externally, and then the editors try their best to handle revisions on their own, so that revisions are more rapidly processed in the system. So that question about whether or not you've submitted previously to the journal is integral in getting your manuscript pretty much in the right place within the ScholarOne system. Then you have these attention questions: confirm the following, solely submitted to this journal, you know, in compliance with ethical guidelines, etc. And then journals will publish special sections, and typically you would be approached to participate in a special section by a guest editor for any given journal. And so if you are working with a team on a special section, you would indicate that here: yes, this manuscript is a part of a special section, or no, I'm just submitting in general to Aging and Mental Health. And as a mentorship moment for those of you out there, it is always a good thing to participate in special sections of journals. They are frequently more heavily read and cited, and so when you have that opportunity, consider carefully if you want to take part in it. Here's also where you indicate the number of figures, number of tables, and number of words, and number of pages of your manuscript. Again, it's very important to pay attention to those word and figure limits for your particular journal, with the knowledge that qualitative and mixed method manuscripts are frequently more lengthy. Then it's time to upload your file. And after you upload your file, you want to compile it, and you'll be prompted prior to actual submission to review your PDF, and be very careful about that. Typically, there's not a problem as long as you're uploading a manuscript in Word format, say. But always check at the end of the process of manuscript submission to be certain that nothing has gone wonky and you've gotten some kind of odd visual in your manuscript, or that, you know, you accidentally hit manuscript not for review as opposed to manuscript for review. Manuscripts often have blind review, so that you prepare a manuscript without the names of the authors, and the manuscript without the names of the authors would be what would go out for review. Okay, so that's just a very quick overview of manuscript submission at one of our prestigious gerontology journals. Just a brief note on mentorship. Because mentorship is important for all of us. Hopefully we receive and provide mentorship throughout our careers. For those who have more experience, put up the definition of mentorship by Zerzan: a symbiotic relationship aimed at advancing careers and career satisfaction for both the mentor and mentee. These relationships should be dynamic, collaborative, and reciprocal, and focused on the mentee's personal and professional development. It's always a good idea to seek mentorship both inside and outside one's own personal proximal work environment. For example, participation in this webinar today is participating in some mentorship that's more distal. Probably many of you are not at any of our given institutions as members of the panel. And then in terms of learning how to write, for those of you who are earlier in your careers, really kind of step up and reach out to those who have more experience. Many labs in psychology, nursing, and public health and other fields work in research vertical teams, so approach students or other people who are somewhat farther along in their career and ask if you can help with any manuscripts. Here, we typically have first-year graduate students work on a first-year project, which is in collaboration with someone else on the team. We all have way more data and way more writing projects than we can get out into the world ourselves, so we are happy for the help. And these relationships you form, number 4, will forge the ties that will follow you the rest of your career and allow you to continue to collaborate with these individuals and teams. So we have gone through our objectives, what you need to know about successful manuscript submission, communicating with journal editors, what you need to know before you submit. We've gone through an overview of the manuscript submission process at Aging and Mental Health, just as an example. And we've talked about peer review and mentorship, laying the groundwork for success. And so remember too that all of us have to start somewhere, and submitting a successful manuscript may seem impossible until it is done. Take some comfort in all of these fine individuals on this slide who have accomplished great things. Thank you much, and now pay forward anything of value that I have presented here today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allen, and I just want to echo the value of mentorship through your student part of your career and through all stages of your career. Everybody can benefit from having a mentor and being a good mentor, because those people who are your mentors, you will remember them forever, and they really are very meaningful and help shape our lives. So thank you once again, Dr. Allen. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rachel Pruchno, the editor of the Gerontologist, and she's going to share some additional wisdom and insight. And while we're getting the slides up for Dr. Pruchno, once again, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the question button at the bottom of your screen in black. Dr. Pruchno, I'm turning it over to you.
Great, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and it's really fun hearing the other 2 editors talk. I feel sort of like, you know, Macy's learning Gimbel's secrets. It's kind of fun, and I hope that the rest of the panel has learned a lot, and I have learned a lot too. I just want to comment before I talk go through my slides. You know, what I'm sort of coming away with as I'm hearing these other editors talk is there are lots and lots of differences in the gerontology journals. So for example, I will take a look at abstracts before they're submitted, and do that often. It doesn't bother me. So you know, we all have our individual differences, but you know, it's sort of, I guess the bottom line is, don't be afraid to ask. The worst that can happen is you get a note like, you know, like Joe does, and saying, well, you know, I really can't do it. But you also might get a response that says, no, this is not appropriate for this journal. And so that really saves you a little bit of time. So it doesn't hurt to ask, I think. And unlike Becky, I never read cover letters. My philosophy is that the manuscript needs to stand on its own, and I don't really care if you can write a nice letter. So again, individual differences. And again, you know, I heard Becky talking about they like to do 1 review. It's the norm for TG is 2 and sometimes 3 back and forth between the author and the reviewer. So again, individual differences, and that's what, you know, makes the world go round. Okay, so I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do this afternoon is talk a little bit. I want to give you a little bit of an introduction to the gerontologist, since I'm not familiar with who all is listening, because I think that understanding the journal will help you understand some of the comments that I'm going to make later in my talk about how do you increase the odds for successfully publishing? So let's see which arrows work. Page. They don't seem to be working on this end. I cannot advance. Lisa?
Why don't you just say next slide, and then Gwen can advance them for you, Rachel.
Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the 2016 TG submissions. Next slide. So as you can see, in last year, 2016, we received 815 submissions. That's a lot, and our journal keeps growing and growing. When I took over as editor in 2011, there were 472. So this year we will double where we were in 2011. So I think that what we're seeing in not only the Gerontologist, but in probably every journal is just this explosion in the number of manuscripts, which is why it's going to be really important for you to understand rejection. And we'll talk about that, and what do you do about it, and how do you respond. Next slide. So again, just to orient you a little bit to the Gerontologist, the majority of articles that we receive are research articles, but we also receive a lot of, we have other types of articles. We have intervention articles that we used to call practice concepts. We're now calling them intervention articles. We have international spotlights. We have policy articles. We have forums. So one of the, if there's one bit of advice that I can give to people, the most important thing is to read the instructions to authors. And it's amazing how people don't read the instructions to authors, because sort of like all the clues that you want to know about the journal are there, and they're in black and white, and they're on the web, and nobody reads them. And we also, our editorial offices are always updating them. So if you're smart, you really, I think a lot of what both Joe and Becky said, the bottom line is read the instructions to authors, and know your journal. Okay, next. So again, in 2016, this will just give you an idea of what happens to the initial decision that is made by an editor. And you can see here that I reject, my journal, that the Gerontologist rejects about 60% of the manuscripts that we get. They are not sent out for review. And we do it, and one of the things I'm very proud of is that we do it quickly. So we don't torture people for too long. If the manuscript is not appropriate for the Gerontologist, we let you know. And I feel like that's fair because then you can go and find another journal and, perhaps a better fit, or, a journal that makes more sense. But I want you to remember that 60% of the manuscripts are rejected out of hand. And again, that's going to, as I talk about some of the slides later in my presentation, you'll understand. I want you to be able to put this in context. Next. Okay, so manuscripts that are sent out. There are initial decisions made on these manuscripts. And you can see the majority of them, 52%, are revise and resubmit. About 40%, though, are rejected after they are reviewed by reviewers. So the big message here is if you ever submit something to the Gerontologist, and probably to any journal, and it comes back, revise and resubmit, you should celebrate. I think most young scholars get a revise and resubmit, and they say, oh, that's terrible. On the contrary, that is something to celebrate. Go out and buy the champagne and celebrate, because that tells you you'll get some really encouraging feedback from reviewers, and it tells you that the manuscript has a chance if you act appropriately. Okay, next. So this slide shows you the final decisions that are made for manuscripts that are sent out for peer review. In the end, 39% are accepted and 45% are rejected. At the time the slide was made, there were some in the system that were pending. Next. What you see here are the acceptance rate and time to make final decisions. Again, for the gerontologist last year, the average days to make all decisions is about 33 days. Of course, it takes longer to accept a manuscript, about 120 days, than to reject it, about 47 days. And that's because what we typically do is we send the manuscript back and forth between the reviewers and the author. And you know, at each point in time, as editor or any of my associate editors are making decisions in response to comments that are made by the reviewers. So just this slide is important here because what this shows you is that of all the manuscripts that we received, that we had made a final decision on, 17% are accepted. So that's not a lot. Okay, next slide. And here's just another way of looking at our acceptance rate. And you know, our acceptance rate has been, it was steady for a while and has been coming down. And as the number of manuscripts that we receive increases, my team is being encouraged by our publisher, OUP, to get tougher. They keep telling me I have to get tougher, get tougher, get tougher, because we just can't publish everything that we get. So I guess, again, this is a good problem. The quality of the science is increasing. That's great. But then for authors, the acceptance rate is declining. Okay, next. Okay, and here you can see the U.S. I'm going to show you U.S. submissions by year. Again, like Aging and Mental Health, we are an international journal. And what's interesting here is that our U.S. submissions have been declining over time. About 47% last year were submissions by people from the U.S. Next slide. And we have been attracting manuscripts from a host of countries, and that's really exciting. 432 of our manuscripts were from international authors. Next slide. But here's the sad story. Here's the sad news. The acceptance rate by international authors is very, very small. Last year, only 4.6% of the international submissions were accepted. And I'm sure you can, imagine why that might be. There are scientific issues, but there are also language issues. And I think all journals really struggle to deal with, how do we deal with, we all want to be international. We want to attract good scholars from throughout the world. But if they can't write in English, that creates a huge problem. Next slide. This slide shows you some of the top keywords from the gerontologist for last year. As you can see, informal caregiving, dementia, long-term care, cognition, health, depression, some of our more popular keywords. And again, this sort of speaks to know your journal. Next slide. And here's a slide of our impact factor that I'm not really going to focus on. So let's go to the next slide. And here we're going to talk a little bit about increasing the odds that your manuscript will be published. Next slide. So first I want to say you're only human. And so here's a truism. Anyone who has ever published has been rejected. And here's a part in my talk when I do this talk in front of an audience, I typically will ask the senior scholars in the room, have you ever had a manuscript rejected? And everybody raises their hand. So rejection is part of this game. Rejection hurts, but it's part of the scientific process. Next slide. So you get a letter from me, and it says, thank you for submitting your manuscript entitled, "This is the most important finding ever" to the gerontologist. While the manuscript addresses an important topic, I'm sorry to tell you that I'm unable to send this out to peer review. So this is telling you there's something wrong with this manuscript, and it's not even getting off of my desk, and you're really, really mad and you hate me. Next slide. So let's talk about some fixable problems, because when I reject a manuscript out of hand, I always tell authors why. And I know that's not typical of all editors, but I feel like authors work really hard to, develop their manuscript and submit it and get through the Scholar 1 process and submit it. So I feel like they need an explanation for why. And believe me, I have submitted articles to some journals, and I just get back this, thank you. I can't send it out for review, and there's no explanation. So I feel like that's kind of useless. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these fixable problems. Next, yeah. So the primary reason for my decision is your manuscript. I guess you got to do it. Hit next. Okay, so this is my favorite. I could do this one in my sleep. Manuscript lacks a conceptual framework and a set of testable hypotheses. So if the first thing I do when I get a manuscript is I read it through quickly, and I'm looking for a conceptual framework and a set of hypotheses. And if it's not, then I don't send it out. That's one of my pet peeves. That it needs to be science, and it needs to be there needs to be a hypothesis, right? So the solution is you find one. You develop you probably had a conceptual framework, and you probably had a hypothesis in mind when you were developing this manuscript, but you got to tell the reader what it is. So that's easy to find that, to find one. Next. Okay, so this is a big one. The gerontologist follows APA format, and if I get a manuscript and the references and all are in AMA format, I know really very quickly that you've submitted to someplace else and you didn't even bother to read the instructions to authors and know that it needs to be in APA format. So that's strike. So very easy to fix. Get your APA manual out and fix it. Next. Not consistent with the mission of our journal. Again, you didn't read the instructions to authors and you're sending me something about cell biology. So the solution is find the right journal for your work. So the manuscript is poorly written and confusing, includes numerous grammatical problems. Again, if you listen to Becky, you wouldn't be doing this. It's really important to write clearly, and this unfortunately when we have a scholar who's not English speaking, it's more and more it's more difficult. I could not write a paper in Chinese or in Mandarin, nor could I write a paper in German. But this is sort of the playing field. If you're publishing in the Gerontologist, the English needs to be understandable. So what do you do about it? Well, you engage an editor or a colleague. Next, yeah, or you hire a translator. Now, this can be expensive, and of course, there's no guarantees. So typically, if the English, especially if we're talking about a non-English speaking author, if I can understand the manuscript and get through it and not get waylaid by the words, I usually will send it out and let it go under review. And one of the things that we have done with the gerontologist is that we have a couple of people on our board who do their service to the journal by helping to, in a sense, translate. Work with authors to, we do this only with manuscripts that the content is ready to accept, but it's rough. Then we have one of our translators work with the author to sort of polish it. And we've done this a few times. I think every year, maybe once or twice. So it's not something we're doing for everybody, but it's once we get the science understandable, then we do that. Okay, next. So some more serious problems. Go ahead. Yeah. So the manuscript's based on a small volunteer sample, or the measures have low reliability, adds little to the literature, uses an inappropriate or flawed research design. There you really can't do much about it. It's sort of dead in the water. So the other thing I want to say is that these manuscripts that are rejected, that are desk rejects, people ask me sometimes, well, can I fix these things and resubmit it? The answer is, you can fix these things and then you can submit it as a new manuscript, but you can't you can't do a revise and resubmit. A revise and resubmit is by invitation only, if you will. So let's talk about revise and resubmit. Next slide. Okay, so this manuscript entitled Really Important Science has been reviewed. I invite you to revise and resubmit. And so you get from the reviewers, from both of the reviewers, or 2 or 3 reviewers, you get comments. So this is the most valuable piece of, this is what, peer review is the most exciting, wonderful thing that we've got going on for us in science. What you get here is you get two people in your field to read your work and to give you comments, and they don't even charge you for it. It's just amazing. Next slide. So the reviewers might suggest that you clarify the conceptual framework, or that you add particular details, or that there are problems with the analysis. So they're going to be very clear about what's wrong. They're just not going to say, well, it needs to be fixed. You know, they'll tell you. I usually get, you know, several paragraphs worth of comments from reviewers about what, you know, this is a manuscript that has a lot of potential, but X, Y, and Z needs to be done. Next. So you get this revise and resubmit. What do? Well, first you carefully attend to each issue that is raised by the reviewers and by the editor. If you disagree, and it's usually not a good idea to disagree with too many things, you need to respectfully explain why. So if I send you a letter and I, you know, between the reviewers and me, we identify, you know, 10 things that need to be done, coming back with a letter saying you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong is not a good idea. You might, you know, disagree with one of the issues, and then you better have a really good explanation for why, because remember, the reviewers are well-established scholars in your field. So yeah, I pick very carefully when I pick reviewers. So their words are to be listened to. So you follow the editor's letter regarding instructions, and you do all this without adding too much length to your article. Sometimes I'll get back a manuscript that's, you know, 1,000 words longer than it was initially. Well, that can't be. We have word limits, and word limits need to be adhered to. So it's kind of a tricky thing to do, but it can be done. Next. So you revise and resubmit, and this is a letter that I do read. You develop your, you revise your manuscript, and you also send back a cover letter. And in this letter, you explain how you addressed each of the issues that the editor and the reviewers identified. If you don't agree, you explain why. And you're polite. You thank the editor and reviewers for their comments, because reviewers don't get paid. Reviewers do this out of, this is service to the community. And so being respectful and thanking the reviewers is very appropriate. And note that the comments were helpful, improve the manuscript, even if you don't believe it. Again, you know, be polite. Do what your mom told you to do. Next. So this, I have this slide in here just to give you an idea of the sort of life course of peer-reviewed manuscripts. And you know, sort of the takeaway here is that most of our manuscripts have, you know, go back and forth between the reviewer and between the author and the reviewer once, but twice is not uncommon. And there are some manuscripts that, you know, there are 3, and if it gets to 4, then we get a little bit nervous. But again, it's a process, and you know, the science gets stronger because of the process. Okay, next. So there's lots of opportunity when in manuscripts submission for rejection. So you can also be rejected after the manuscript is reviewed. Now, so here a decision is made based on what the reviewers have recommended to the editor. So again, so what you get here is you get specific comments from the reviewers, and here the reviewers are saying things like, there are some really serious problems here, and when I read these as the editor, I kind of conclude that this manuscript either is not a good fit, or there's so much that needs to be done and we just don't have the time to walk you through it. So then the manuscript will be rejected. Next slide. So what do you do then? Well, so first do nothing, but simmer for a few days, because you should never do anything when you're mad. Then you read the manuscript with a critical eye and consider alternative journals. And don't be afraid to try one with a higher impact factor. The next thing you do is you want to rewrite the manuscript for the new journal. And that doesn't mean just ship it off. You need to go and read the instructions to authors, and you need to make sure that the manuscript is structured appropriately for the new journal. And if you're smart, you'll take advantage of the reviews that you got from the gerontologist as you revise the manuscript, because gerontology is a small world, and I wouldn't be surprised, and this happens all the time, if the second journal that you sent it to the same reviewers that I sent it to. And reviewers, nothing pisses the reviewers off more than, I reviewed this for another journal and it's the exact same manuscript. When I hear that, it's like, forget it, dead in the water. Okay, next slide. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That was wonderful insight to share with us today. And really, once again, thank you to all of our presenters today. I have a couple questions, and I've been a couple common themes that have come through the Q&A today. And one of the questions that I did not hear any of the presenters address today, and this is going to be obviously journal specific, so if you get that positive letter that your paper has been accepted to this journal, what is the publication lag for your journal? So how about Becky, what is the publication lag for Aging and Mental Health?
Thank you, Lisa. Online publication is relatively rapid, but print publication can be a year later. So for example, if you receive an acceptance, then, and I'm going to give you a ballpark, don't quote me on this, but after an accepted manuscript, you may be published online within 60 to 90 days. And then it may be 12 months before it comes out in print.
Okay, Joe?
You know, I think we're kind of in the same boat as Aging and Mental Health. You know, when I took over as editor, we had a significant backlog, and then since I've been editor, the number of submissions has not quite doubled, but it's gone up quite a bit. And so we've been consistently upping the number of issues and the number of page limits too. And it's a real balancing act between that and the impact factor, because one of the things that can occur is if you have more articles that are published in any given year, that means that you have a higher risk for your impact factor going down, if that makes sense. So yeah, but with that in mind, at the same time, you know, our publication to digital version and final digital form is very quick. It's probably within a month, maybe even sooner at the point of acceptance. So yeah, I think that's where we're at in our journal. Okay, Rachel, what about you guys?
Yeah, so I think that we're pretty similar. I think within weeks of acceptance, it is that an article is published online, and I think it's really important for people to understand what that means. When an article is published online, it receives a DOI number, which means it's published. Period. Done. In terms of when it might appear in print, we're probably the worst of the journals. You know, we've got some manuscripts that it can take 2 years to appear in print, but that doesn't really matter because the article it's published, it's done, and you know, it's available and people can see it. So you know, I think that at some point in print is going to sort of be a dinosaur. So you know, I think that we are able to publish things very, very quickly. Now, you know, certainly quicker than we ever could before we had online. So, yeah.
Great, thank you very much. So now one other question that I have is when you as an editor make the decision to send something out for peer review, is that based on reading the entire article, or is that just looking at reading through the abstract, or does it just depend on the situation? So I'll start with Rachel.
Sure. Yes, I read the whole article. I don't study the whole article. I read it. I'm looking for certain things. For example, I'm looking to make sure it's got a conceptual framework, and that I'm taking a quick look at the measures, making sure that the measures in the sample that are appropriate. But I don't get lost in the weeds. I mean, that's the job of the reviewers, to really pick the article apart and identify, you know, what kinds of problems it has. So if it passes that sort of initial cutoff, Then I will send it out for review.
Okay, Joe?
Yeah, I agree with Rachel in terms of the approach. When I'm as an editor, I don't approach submissions as I do a reviewer. I focus more on overall quality and fit for the journal. And in doing that, then that's when I kind of base my decision as to whether I send the paper out or not for peer review.
Okay, Becky?
I agree with Joe and Rachel. Exactly the same, nothing to add.
Okay. All right, and let me just remind our listeners on the phone, if you do have questions, please type them in the Q&A icon on the bottom of the black bar. So one of the other questions that we received was about collaborative writing, and I know Becky and Joe have put some responses in, but do you have tips for authors that are engaging in this very normal collaborative writing process? Becky, we'll start with you.
Yes, online through the text, Joe actually responded perfectly well and said that have the writing responsibilities straight up front. When I was a graduate student in training, my mentor, Martha Durant, always had that conversation about order of authorship and who was responsible for writing what sections and how much. That needs to be a live and ongoing conversation because things shift when you're writing collaboratively in teams, and those who put in the most work for any given manuscript should receive the most credit. That should be discussed up front with a plan, and if that plan changes, then you just need to adjust.
Okay. Rachel or Joe, do you have anything to add with that or other tips for our authors?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't. I think it's really an ongoing negotiation and conversation amongst the team.
Okay. All right. Well, there's been some discussion with you all about the letters, and I'm just going to kind of lump them together. So when we come to the cover letter, I mean, Rachel, you were very honest and said you don't really pay attention to the cover letter. What about the other editors? So, Joe, what about you? How important is the cover letter?
Yeah, as part of, I guess, our submission process, we ask for certain things in the cover letter, and I know other journals do this too, that we use to, just assure, for example, I think we ask about the IRB number and things like that, or human subjects review and ethical kind of compliance in the cover letter, so we kind of deal with it at that level. Certain journals do it differently. So yeah, I kind of like Rachel, I can't say I pour over every cover letter, but we do use it for at least administrative purposes.
Okay. And Becky, I also heard you say with the cover letter to make sure that it's addressed to the correct journal editor and the correct journal. Do you have any other advice for a cover letter, and how important is the content of the cover letter for your journal?
Well, for the initial submission, I agree with what Rachel and Joe have said, that it's sort of truthfully an attention check. If you are submitting a journal article and aren't paying close enough attention to answer the questions about IRB number or address your correspondence to the correct editor, that bodes poorly for the success of your manuscript. Certainly, letters written in response to revision are much more closely attended to than the cover letter initially.
Okay.
Yeah, I definitely.
Go ahead, Rachel. Sorry.
Yeah, I definitely agree. When you're revising a manuscript, the cover letter is very important, and it's the first thing that I read and the first thing that the reviewers read. They want to make sure that the issues were addressed, and so this is your opportunity to say, yes, I heard you, and here's what I did.
Yeah, and kind of dovetailing on what Rachel said in part of her presentation, and kind of what Becky just mentioned, I do use that if I see that it's addressed to the wrong person in journal, my antenna goes up, because in all likelihood, this could very well be a paper that was just turned around and wasn't improved from a prior submission to another journal. So, I mean, that's kind of one way to kind of, again, use as this whole gatekeeper role.
Okay, Becky, thoughts?
Oh, I think I answered earlier.
Okay, I'm sorry, then I'm getting confused here. But I was going to say, as a reviewer, always look at that letter, the revise and resubmit letter, to see, and I figure out which reviewer I was and see what the comments were. So as a journal editor, I guess one of my questions for you is, let's say reviewer number 1 tells the author to do X and has them kind of take the article in a slightly different slant, maybe repackage something, do some new statistical analysis, and reviewer number 2 says, this is just great this way, or in a later revision tells them to take it out. What should an author be doing at that point, and how should they be interfacing with you and handling those situations? So conflicting reviewer comments.
Yeah, so I'll take that one first. So I think, first it's important to understand that reviewers make recommendations and editors make decisions. So they're very different. So reviewers are not making decisions about the manuscript. They just advise the editor. So when I get reviews, one reviewer says, make X, Y, and Z changes, and the other one, if there's a difference in sort of the message, I will then advise the author. So I'll say, pay special attention to reviewer 1's comment about the methods, or pay special attention to reviewers' comments, comments about something else. But what really strikes me as an editor is how often the two we have 2 reviewers for each manuscript, at least 2, sometimes 3 if there's a extenuating circumstances. But it always amazes me how consistent the comments from reviewers are. But when it's not, then it's my job as the editor to advise the author, to who they should listen to.
Okay. Joe, Becky?
Go ahead, Becky.
Okay, Joe, I agree with what Rachel said, and I think as an editor, I really like that reviewers make suggestions and editors make decisions. We choose our reviewers very carefully, and they are experts in a particular field of relevance to the topic that the manuscript addresses. And if one of my 2, possibly 3, usually 2 reviewers has a significant issue with a manuscript methodology, or lack of conceptual model, or lack of implications for the field, I pay really close attention to that. And it's uncommon if one of my reviewers has concerns that I don't decide that those need to be addressed.
Yeah, I agree with all these points, and they're excellent ones. And I'm going to switch hats here and think of it as from an author standpoint. This hasn't happened very often, but in the past, and in this one case, it was actually a very good journal outside of the gerontology discipline. It was another discipline, and the editor, in a way, just kind of let the review kind of go on and never really inserted herself or himself. And so we ended up going through like 3 revisions where after the first revision, it appeared that we were close to getting it accepted. Then either a new reviewer was added or something happened with the reviewer, and this kind of went back and forth, and there was all this inconsistency, and the editor never really stepped in and said, okay, this is what I would like to see, et cetera, to kind of move this paper on, and hopefully you can address this. The editor never did that. And eventually, after multiple revisions, it ended up getting rejected. And I really felt as an author that if I ever had the opportunity, either as a reviewer or as editor, I would never allow that to happen. And I think you heard from Becky and Rachel, who both have excellent editorial skills, they wouldn't either.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Joe, you brought up a good thing, or a good point about the revision process, and sometimes new reviewers get added. So editors, is that something that you try to avoid?
Yeah, so I certainly do. I think that whenever I can, but we always go back to the initial reviewers. And what sometimes happens is that one of the initial reviewers is not available. And again, we have to remember that reviewers do this. This is a gratis kind of thing. So they may have a grant proposal due, or they may have, something going on in their family, and they just can't get to it. But so whenever possible, we do go back to the initial reviewers. When the initial reviewer is not available, then we have to find somebody new. And so the plea that I will make to people listening is that if you do review for journals, you know, it's a commitment because you would want your work to be reviewed by the same person. I mean, this only makes sense, right? So if you're a reviewer and you have XYZ problems and the author fixes XYZ problems, and you're not available to put your stamp of it's okay now, and so the editor has to go get a new reviewer who's going to say ABC now is a problem. So you know, it's to authors' benefits to have the same reviewers involved, and you know, we try whenever possible to use the same reviewers. Yeah.
And the only thing I would add to what Joe and Rachel have already said is at Aging and Mental Health, we do try to only have one round of external reviews if possible. Now, of course, any manuscript has different sort of layers or levels. It's very, very rare to be accepted outright. You might be accepted with minor or major revisions or get a revise and resubmit. And at Aging and Mental Health, revise and resubmit is, well, you sneaked in under the wire in a cracked window, but there's some significant work to be done. So typically we will send those kind of manuscripts back out for a review, but if we can, just in order to expedite the process, the editors try to handle like, you know, maybe major revisions at the editorial level.
Okay. Well, and that definitely eliminates getting some of those reviewers back. Rachel or Joe, do you guys, I know, Rachel, you send articles out for multiple revisions to the reviewers. Joe, what is the process with your journal?
It's the same, and you know, there are some instances, and honestly, as an editor, I never, even as a reviewer, I never quite. Well, I'll take that back. Basically, yeah, it's the same issue. We do our best to try to maintain continuity with the reviewers. For whatever reasons, there may be instances where that doesn't occur. If that's the case, try to be as transparent as possible with the newly invited reviewers about where the paper is and what we would expect from the subsequent reviews. It's just one of those issues as an editors you can't always avoid, but yeah, that's what we really try to do.
Okay. Well, so let me ask you all as editors, how does somebody become a reviewer down the road or now, depending on their stage of career development?
So the gerontologist encourages emerging scholars to get involved in the review process. There's nothing like being a reviewer to strengthen your own work. And so one of the things, there are a couple of ways that young scholars can get involved. And one is to go into the Scholar One system that we use, just like Becky's journal. I don't know if Joe's journal uses Scholar One, but go into the Scholar One system and just sign up as a novice reviewer. We have that. You can just, you know, put your information in, you put your name in, you put your affiliation in, you put your keywords in, which is really, really important. Because when I'm looking for a reviewer, I use the Scholar One database. And I'll look for somebody who knows something about, by topic. So the more appropriate keywords you can put in, the better. And then you identify yourself as a novice reviewer. And if I have a paper in your area, I may call on you to review it. And then once an individual has done 2 reviews as a novice reviewer, we take the novice off of them and they're just in our database like everybody else. Another way that emerging scholars can get involved as reviewers of the Gerontologist is to work with your mentor. We encourage senior scholars, if we send them a manuscript, to consider working with a junior scholar. And sometimes people will have a graduate student, do an independent read of a paper, and then the mentor and the junior scholar will discuss it, and then one review is submitted from that team. Because in our checklist, we always ask whether the review was done in conjunction with somebody else. So there are 2 ways that, and again, we really encourage people to get involved as graduate students, as young faculty. It's never too once you're a graduate student, it's time to really start thinking about being a reviewer.
Okay, Becky, how does someone become a reviewer for aging and mental health?
Well, Excellent question, and I do really love, I'm going to say this out loud, the system that the gerontologist has, where you can go through the Scholar One system and add junior colleagues who are helping review a manuscript. We do not have that more formal system in aging and mental health. However, we do encourage graduate students and young professionals to review manuscripts, and one of the ways that you can do that is similarly to what Rachel described, exactly what Rachel described. Go in through Scholar One and sign up. Be careful about your keywords. Again, that's what we'll all be looking for. Or you can always email myself or one of the other editors at Aging and Mental Health. For the Americas, I would be the person you'd want to talk to, and I can definitely hook you up. We're always looking for reviewers.
Okay, thank you. So Joe, how do we become a reviewer for you?
Yeah, it's all the same. We do use Scholar One manuscript as well, and people are encouraged to sign up. And in contrast to what I mentioned before about sending me an abstract or something, is if people do just email me directly and say, I would love to be a reviewer and here's my areas of interest, you're added to the reviewer list. And I mean, we welcome that very much. So that's another way, and I think many editors would welcome that too.
Yeah, well, one of the other comments I want to make is that when we do have a novice reviewer who's reviewing a paper, that reviewer is in addition to the usual 2 reviewers. So if there is a novice reviewer, an author would get the comments from 3 reviewers. And what's really very interesting is my experience when I do have a novice reviewer on a paper, that review is usually the best review of the 3.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Well, one last question I want to ask, and then I'm going to give me an opportunity to give me your last thoughts for the day. One question that comes through was about impact factors, and I know Joe has answered this online, but for those who haven't been checking the Q&A, what is a reasonable impact factor? So if you're looking for a journal, what criteria should people be looking, and how should they evaluate that number? So we'll start with Joe, please.
Yeah, I provided a written answer to this question online, and I've had colleagues here at the University of Minnesota say things like, and this is someone outside of nursing or behavioral social science, say things like, well, if a journal has an impact factor under 1, it really doesn't exist. And I think that was kind of harsh. Obviously all of us would like to publish in all of our work in the top tier journals with the highest impact factor. Clearly we all want that, and that would be wonderful. But so much of this is dependent on discipline and how your field views a given journal. Some journals I know have impact factors under 1, but would be seen as very acceptable places to disseminate work. Because, for example, they could be a society journal. They could be a journal that's a shared outlet for a given group of professionals or a subfield of professionals. And with that in mind, those are perfectly acceptable places to be published. Like I mentioned in my slides, yes, impact factor is important, but at the same time, I think it's just as important to know and understand, if I publish in this given journal, will this journal be listed, and will this article be accessible to others on key scientific databases, other search mechanisms that would allow my work to be recognized and hopefully be cited by others in my discipline or beyond. I think that's just as important as impact factor.
Okay, thank you. Any other thoughts on impact factor, Rachel or Becky?
Yeah, I do. First, I'd like to say that there are other metrics that I think are even more important, especially for somebody publishing for the first time. And I would encourage you to think about things like, how long does it take to get a paper reviewed, and how long is the process at this journal, especially for people that are worried about getting tenure. You might have an impact factor, a journal with a really high impact factor, but if it takes 2 years to get this thing accepted, you probably don't have that kind of time. So I would encourage you to think about other metrics. I would also encourage you to think about the acceptance rate. I think the goal for somebody starting out is not to publish in a really high impact factor. It's just to get a publication in a reputable journal. And I say reputable journal because, one of the things I want to caution people about is there are so many not reputable journals that are being published in somebody's basement in China or India. So I really encourage you to be very, very careful about where you send your manuscripts. I'm not saying that online only journals are a problem, but I think that you really have to, every day I must get a half dozen, publish in my journal emails. And most of these are from journals that I've never heard of that, they're collecting fees and they are, again, in somebody's basement and there's no peer review. I think what's most important is you want your work peer reviewed in a reputable journal.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Becky?
And I agree with what Rachel and Joe have said. The other thing that I would add is you want to think about fit and readership. And this relates back to some of what both of Joe and Rachel have said. But if you are getting yourself known, say, in clinical geropsychology, well, there may be particular journals that will give you more bang for the buck that would not have the highest impact factor, but would still provide a really good avenue to start networking and get your work out there.
Okay, thank you. So we are winding down at this. I'd like to go to each of the editors and ask them the one biggest piece of advice they have for everybody. So we'll start with Rachel.
One piece of advice is read the instruction to authors and know your journal.
I would have predicted you were going to say that based on your presentation. So, okay. Dr. Allen, what would you say, the biggest piece of advice?
Be very careful in submitting your response to reviewer comments, your revise and resubmit. Be sure that you address the comments. Be sure that you actually do provide comments and that you follow the instructions that are provided to you from the journal.
Okay, thank you. Joe?
Yeah, and I think this dovetails with a lot of what we talked about today, but I think always to keep in mind, and it's hard to do this when we're so focused on quote-unquote productivity and quote-unquote outputs and stuff, but I think all great science, regardless of discipline, is a process. And similarly, when one is submitting and disseminating their work, it's very much a process as well. And as was mentioned earlier, we've all suffered through rejections. We've all suffered through difficult review experiences. But taking and getting wisdom and obtaining wisdom from that and then applying it to our work moving ahead, whether it's the current project or subsequent ones, I think that's key to not only disseminating great work, but becoming a good scholar.
Great. Well, I want to once again thank our speakers today. They are phenomenal editors, and they gave us a lot of great information today that we can apply to our work starting immediately. So once again, thank you, Joseph Gaugler, Dr. Rebecca Allen, Dr. Rachel Pruchno, and then I'd like to thank my colleagues at the University of Washington, Dr. Basha Belza and Gwen Money, for coordinating this webinar today. And if you are registered for this webinar, you will receive a link to the webinar and the archive. So thank you so much for participating, and we look forward to reading your work in a journal soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.